Concept 56.3 says landscape and regional conservation help sustain biodiversity. Although in the past conservation efforts oftentimes kind of focus solely on individual species, that's not usually the way we go about it today. Conservation biology usually attempts to sustain the biodiversity of entire communities, ecosystems, and landscapes. So if we want to save, say, the polar bears, great example. If we want to save the polar bears, modern conservation biology is about saving the ecosystem that supports those polar bears, not just trying to do what it might take to directly save the polar bears. Because we know if we save the ecosystem and the community and landscape that supports the polar bears, then that will be saving the polar bears. So if we can conserve their habitat, we can conserve them. Ecosystem management is part of what we call landscape ecology, which seeks to make biodiversity conservation part of land use planning. So if we are going to go in and make changes to an environment, we want to try to think about how are these changes going to affect the species that live there, how is that going to have an impact on biodiversity, things of that nature. Planning ahead instead of just going in and cutting down the forest and building a mall, thinking about what we can do to lessen that impact on other species. One of the things we look at is the lay of the land. The layout of the land, which we might call the structure of the landscape, can strongly influence biodiversity. A good example of this is fragmentation, where we talked about how big, huge plots of land are broken up into smaller plots, and that becomes a problem. For one thing, the boundaries or edges between ecosystems, the boundary between a forest and, say, an open field, that boundary area is its own separate little ecosystem. You find creatures that thrive and live in the boundaries that don't necessarily thrive and live on either side. The physical conditions of that boundary are different from the forest or the field. The edge is different, and some species take advantage of that edge community to kind of get resources from both sides, and they do well in that edge community. But not all the species that you want may benefit from having all those edges. As a matter of fact, many species don't. The fragmentation of their habitat oftentimes leads to lower numbers and lower species diversity. So here you have two different versions of edges of ecosystems. Here you kind of have natural edges, where this was done by nature. You have some open areas, some lowlands where you see the little stream, and then you have some forested areas. And there are lots of creatures that do best along these edges where they can access both the open area and the forest. But here where you have the forest, you see how it's all connected. So there's still plenty of connected area for the forest dwelling creatures to live. And then here you have edges created by man, where you have all the forest around, and then you have this cutout portion in the middle. Looks like it's for agriculture. These edges might not be as conducive to population and biodiversity as these natural edges might be. Your textbook talks about this particular project going on in the Amazon rainforest called the Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragments Project, and they are studying the effects of fragmentation on diversity. Landscapes that tend to be dominated by pieces and chunks of fragmented habitats support fewer species because there is a lost species adapted to the habitat interior. So if you are a species that is used to living in the depths of the forest, and now you just have these little plots of forest that are broken up by this open land, you're not going to do as well. So I would say that 4 little pockets of forest equal in size to one big pocket of forest is not going to do as well. It's not just the sheer number of acres, it's how those acres are placed. Are they all together or are they fragmented? When they're fragmented, that's usually problematic. One way to deal with this problem is to build corridors, what we call wildlife corridors or movement corridors. It's usually a narrow strip of habitat or land that connects these patches. If you can kind of build bridges to connect these patches, you help out a little bit. So this promotes movement and dispersal of the species from one little patch to the next little patch. In areas of heavy human use, like cities, highways, roads, building artificial corridors can sometimes be very beneficial as well. So if we're going to change the ecosystem, we might want to leave natural corridors, or we might even want to build artificial corridors to help these creatures move from one little patch to the next little patch. Here's some examples of artificial corridors. This is basically a bridge, and it's a bridge for wildlife. It's a bridge for creatures to get from one plot of land to the next without crossing this highway. Here in East Texas, in Northeast Texas, hundreds of white-tailed deer get squished on the highways every year. Think about armadillos, squirrels, all the little creatures you see on the roadside dead. Well, if they had these bridges, that might help their movement and lessen the chance of mortality by car accident. Another great example seen, this is kind of a beautiful aerial shot. This is a wildlife overpass on the Trans-Canada Highway in Banff National Park, British Columbia. So you see some fairly thick wild forests on either side, and you have this highway that cuts right through the middle. It segments the forest and causes all sorts of problems. Well, they've tried to help alleviate some of those problems by building these little bridges, these natural wildlife bridges, so creatures can cross from one side to the other, and hopefully lessen the chance of death by car and increase the chance that the species will move from one side to the other more freely. Another thing, of course, that we can do to help biodiversity is to establish protected areas of some kind, whether that's national parks or conservation areas. Currently, various governments have set aside about 7% of the world's land in various forms of reserves. Now, I will tell you that the vast majority, or probably a large percentage at least, of those set aside areas are parts of the world that are pretty remote, where human population density is already low. So like, for example, in Alaska, there are huge chunks of land set aside as a reserve or natural park, but that's not that big of a deal to humans. I mean, it doesn't really impact as much because there's not nearly as many humans that live in Alaska. So unfortunately, there are other areas of the world that are very important for biodiversity, but they're also high in human population, and that's where you start to get a lot of the conflicts as to which land should you set aside, and should you open it up to human development or should you not. So currently about 7% of the world is set aside through various means to form reserves or conservation areas. If we're going to set up limited conservatory areas, conservation areas, biodiversity hotspots would be the place to do it. This is a relatively small area with a great concentration of endemic species. Endemic means they're found nowhere else. Many endangered and threatened species. So there are certain parts of the globe that you might consider more biologically important than others. In other words, they contain more species within a square mile, and a lot of those species are very unique and found nowhere else. We would call these hotspots, biodiversity hotspots, and these would be good choices for nature reserves. Identifying these hotspots is not always easy, though, because as changes occur in climate and overall biological patterns, not just living patterns, but also weather patterns and the like, these hotspots can kind of shift and move around a little bit. One of the other problems is that humans tend to prefer thinking about and conserving large vertebrates. They're biased towards saving vertebrates and plants, and often what is a hotspot for one type of creature may not be a particular hotspot for another type of creature. Got some mistakes in here. So if you create a hotspot to help save a particular type of monkey, say for example, well, you may be leaving out somewhere else an area that is especially important to some particular types of plants. So again, it's that conflict between what are you going to use for man and what are you going to use for nature, and how are you going to resolve all of that. The other thing to keep in mind is that hotspots can change with climate change as species migrate and ranges shift. So if you say this 200 acres is a nature preserve, well, let's say over the next 100 years that the climate changes and the patterns of migration shift away from that 200 acres. Well, what are you going to do then? How are you going to keep those species conserved or protected if suddenly now they are venturing out of that area because their habitat has changed? Great example of an area that would be considered a hotspot is a coral reef, and I think we have a short little video clip there in the notes folder. So here's another map that shows you some terrestrial biodiversity hotspots and some marine hotspots. Again, you would expect it to be close to the equator. That's where you have plenty of sunlight, plenty of moisture, lots of biodiversity. So all of these kind of reddish tan areas would be considered biodiversity hotspots, and then the little blue triangle that you see would be considered marine biodiversity hotspots. Great places for conservation or national parks, things of that nature, if we want to try to save as many species as possible. An example of a conservation area that kind of falls in the midst of human activity might be a nature reserve, and this is an aerial shot of Central Park, which is not really a nature reserve, but it gives you that idea. This is a plot of land, fairly large plot of land, right in the middle of Lower Manhattan in New York City, and you see New York City surrounding this large rectangle of land that's known as Central Park. There are creatures that live in this park. There are deer, there are large mammals that live in this park. It is a very small area and they are surrounded by nothing but mankind, but this would be considered sort of a nature reserve, a miniature nature reserve, a biodiversity island in a sea of habitat degraded by human activity. Nature reserves must consider disturbances a functional component of all ecosystems. So if you are part of a nature reserve, you know there's going to be disturbances because you are basically surrounded by humankind. One of the questions that conservation biologists deal with is whether or not you should create fewer large reserves or more numerous small reserves. And there's an argument for both. An argument for large reserves is that large, far-ranging animals with low-density populations require extensive habitats. So if you want to save a large mammal like a rhinoceros, you better have a large reserve, a large contiguous reserve. Smaller reserves may be more realistic and may slow the spread of disease throughout a population. If you have smaller reserves kind of separated from each other, you do have some problems, but there may be some benefits because, well, for one, it may be more likely that you'll get the permission or the ability to create that preserve if it's smaller, and it might help if there's ever a problem with a disease within the species. You might be able to contain that disease or limit its spread to the rest of the species. Enlarging current reserves or creating new large ones is unlikely due to human use pressure. So from this point forward, there are so many humans on the earth that it's very unlikely that we're going to be creating new large reserves. So this focus on smaller ones is important because that's probably really all we have left. That's all we're going to get permission to create from this point forward, just due to the competing needs of human population. Going back to the grizzly bears we talked about, here's Yellowstone National Park. This solid line that you see here is the biotic boundary for short-term survival. MVP is 50 individuals. So within this little line you can have about 50 grizzly bears living. That's not good. That's not a large enough population to ensure their survival. This dotted line shows you the biotic boundary for long-term survival. This would include enough land and area for about 500 bears, and that would be of a population size that would allow them to survive for the foreseeable future. The problem is there is mankind all within this dotted line area, and only the green is the actual national park. So all around this there is human civilization, there's farmland, there's ranchers, there's houses, and that's a problem because we can't make all of this dotted line area a reserve. That's not going to happen. That's just not realistic. Humankind is not going to say, yes, we want to devote that much land to grizzly bears, but that's really what's needed for their enhanced survival probability. So what are we going to do? How are we going to balance the needs of other species with the needs of humans? One way to deal with that is what we call zoned reserves. Zoned reserves is kind of a mixture of conservation areas mixed in with human activity. So a zone reserve includes some relatively natural undisturbed areas and then some kind of modified buffer zones between those natural areas and the human activity. Zone reserves are often established as what we call conservation areas. A great example can be found in Costa Rica. Costa Rica has become a world leader in establishing zoned reserves. Costa Rica makes a lot of money off of tourist and ecotourism, and so they need this kind of zoned reserve system to maintain the habitats but also allow human interaction and human use of the land. So you have these national park lands, which are in the dark green, but then around the parklands you have certain buffer zones that only allow for specific types of use. So they wouldn't allow, say, the building of a highway and a mall in the buffer zone area here, but they might allow for, say, some small tourist type hotels or something that were kind of sensitive to the ecology of the area. So they have this zoned reserve type system to where they have the natural protected land and then they kind of have buffer land, which usually has some distinct requirements around it, and they kind of mix the use of humans with the use and needs of other living creatures. Other great examples of zoned reserves would be in the Fiji Islands, or in the United States, in the Florida Keys, there's something called the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, and these are all nice, good examples of zone conservation areas. So here you have Florida and all the little islands that make up the Florida Keys, and then you have this giant marine sanctuary that goes around all of the keys, and it limits the diving you can do there, it limits the fishing, it limits the boat traffic and that type of thing, to allow for greater conservation of all the species that live here, because this is certainly a biodiversity hotspot there in the Florida Keys. We'll take one more quick break, come back with Concept 56.4. This one is not a good one. This one is a bummer. Concept 56.4 says the Earth is changing rapidly as a result of human actions, and by change, that doesn't necessarily mean negative, but I've got bad news for you because most of that change is negative. So we're going to talk about that coming up, Concept 56.4.